And good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I am so very glad to be back with you. Last week was my first week to be back with you since contacting COVID. It's a really slow process. I was telling somebody this week. They were asking me how I was doing, and I said, well, it's really kind of interesting. I said, day before yesterday, the minute my eyes opened, I was like, wow, I feel good. Well, not good, but I feel better. The day after that, not so good. So I told this individual, I said, sometimes it seems like I take one step forward and then two steps back. But that's evidently just the process. So I hope you don't get it. If you've had it, take care of yourself. Take your vitamin C. Again, just take care of yourself. Okay, I want to get right straight back into our study of Kairos, the term, the appointed time. Now remember, we are studying the challenge of Christ. And the challenge of Christ is stated very simply. John chapter 10, verse 37. Where Jesus said, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. Now, as I shared with you last week, it's absolutely fascinating. It's humorous. Well, if it wasn't so sad, it would be humorous. But some people are actually willing to deny the reality of the challenge of Christ. And they say that I'm just a false teacher for pointing to John chapter 10 and verse 37 and for quoting it to you time after time after time. They just scoff at the idea. Now, at the same time, they know that if Jesus did not raise himself from the dead, then he's not the Son of God. They know that his prediction that he was going to raise himself from the dead is part of the challenge of Christ. They know that. Because Paul said, if Christ is not risen, your faith is in vain. You are yet in your sin. We are found to be false witnesses. You see, these people that ridicule me for pointing out the challenge of Christ, they know the challenge of Christ is real in regard to the resurrection. But since they realize that if the challenge of Christ is valid and true and applicable to Christ's second coming, they're in trouble. Their traditional view of eschatology is in trouble. So they agree that the challenge of Christ applied to Jesus' resurrection, but it doesn't apply to his prediction of his second coming. Now, folks, you want to talk about argumentum ad desperatum? There it is. Okay, so the challenge of Christ is, he said he was going to come back in the lifetime of the first century generation. Matthew 16, 27 and 28. I've been sharing with you how the book of Revelation is very, very often the final court of appeal. Just yesterday and today on YouTube and Facebook, I have been accosted by several different people who have just said, nothing in the book of Revelation has been fulfilled. Absolutely nothing. And another individual said, we are waiting for the wedding of Christ, which will be at his second coming. I posted in response to that, the wedding took place at the destruction of Babylon. Babylon is where the Lord was crucified, Revelation 11:8. Jesus was crucified at Jerusalem. Therefore, the wedding took place at the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And the only response this guy could offer was, are you trying to tell me Revelation chapter 19 is fulfilled? You see, he's got this concept, as so many people do, of the coming of the Lord. The coming of the Lord in this man's paradigm is Jesus as a 5'5" Jewish man in a physical body coming out of heaven riding a cumulus cloud with the literal, audible sound of a trumpet, in literal visible fire, etc., etc. And because that hasn't happened literally, he denies or wants to explain away all of the time statements that I've shared with you here on Now TV over the last 2 years, over and over. Now, a couple of weeks ago, 3 or 4 weeks ago actually, I began sharing with you thoughts on the book of Revelation. And in the book of Revelation, it says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God, that's the Father, gave to him to show to his servants things which must shortly come to pass. Greek term, entarkai, shortly, translated shortly here. Verse 3, blessed is he who keeps the words of the sayings of this book, because, pardon me, the time has drawn near. I've been pointing out to you that the word for time that is translated there is the Greek word kairos. We spent a good little bit of time on this. But I want to see if I can drive home for you how important the New Testament statements are, in which Jesus and the New Testament writers, such as John in Revelation chapter 1, verse 3, said the appointed time, Greek word again, is kairos, and it means appointed time. So consider this. John was told by the Father, who knew the day and the hour of Christ's second coming, the time, the appointed time, has drawn near. Now, this is in what is known as the perfect tense in the Greek. The perfect tense means that which was once not near is now near. The time, the appointed time, has arrived, is one way to translate the perfect tense of kairos. Now look, folks, that translation alone ought to stop us in our tracks if we are one of those who tries to argue, well, you know, God just doesn't see time like we do. God doesn't communicate in time like we do. Well, wait a minute. Do you remember? Jesus said, Mark chapter 13, 31 and following, but of that day and hour knows no man, not the angels, no, not the Son, but the Father only. The Father knew the day and the hour. Out the window goes the argument that God doesn't see time, because he sees time in days and hours, you know, just like we do. And in Revelation 1:1 through 3, it was the Father who knew the day and the hour, who was saying these things will shortly come to pass, and who was saying the appointed time has drawn near. Now, last week I called your attention to 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 10 to 12. First of all, I noticed that verse 9 says, those brethren were in the process, present participial form of the Greek text. They were in the process of receiving the end, the telos, the goal of their faith. That is, the salvation of their souls. They were not receiving a restoration to the land, a restoration of the city, a restoration of the temple, a restoration of the priesthood. The goal of their faith was the salvation of their soul. Do you see how important it is to understand that? My dispensational friends say the goal of eschatology, the goal of faith of the diaspora, was restoration to the land, the city, the temple, priesthood, etc. No. Peter said the goal of their faith, the diaspora, was the salvation of their soul. Now, last week I began reading, and I had to cut it short because I ran out of time. And if you've been watching me for 2 years, you know I have a tendency to run out of time because I get to going and, all this stuff comes into my head that I've studied that needs to be said, needs to be applied. And so I find myself running out of time too quickly. So last week, I began reading and I shared with you verse 9, but notice verse 10. Of this salvation, what salvation? Salvation of the soul. Of this salvation, the prophets, that's the Old Testament prophets, have inquired and searched diligently. And boy, the language there is extremely powerful. They labored intently, fervently, zealously to try to understand the things that they were predicting. Now, I've just got to give this little digression here. We are told over and over and over again, the Bible says what it means. It means what it says. I mean, after all, if the Bible is that clear, if the Bible is that unambiguous, why did these prophets have to search so diligently, so fervently, what's the word? Folks, they dug into it, trying to understand the things that they themselves were predicting. Because they did not understand. More on that in a moment. So, when the Old Testament prophets spoke of the Messianic temple, well, everybody knows what a temple is, don't they? And yet Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2 says the diaspora, in receiving the end of their faith, notice what he says in verse 5. You also as living stones are being built up, a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices, wholly acceptable unto God through Jesus Christ. What does he say? Spiritual temple, spiritual priesthood, spiritual sacrifices. I thought everybody understood what a temple was. So here's Peter, who is the apostle to the circumcision, to the Jews, telling the diaspora that they were receiving the goal of their faith. They were being built up into the spiritual temple of God. Not one word about a literal physical temple. Spiritual temple. Do you see how powerful this is? Let me tell you something. A few years ago, I debated Dr. Michael Brown, a world-renowned Christian apologist. When I went to 1 Peter chapter 1, 10 to 12, and pointed out the contrast between what the earthly Jews wanted and what the New Testament writers, inspired by the Holy Spirit, were saying was the real goal of their faith, i.e., a spiritual temple, a spiritual priesthood, spiritual sacrifices, Dr. Brown was literally confused. He had never seen that before. And I want to tell you, I have had significant number of people who watched that debate who have told me, by the way, I debated him twice, but I've had a significant number of people tell me that they followed his ministry for years and years. They had never, ever, ever seen him so bumfuzzled. And that these same individuals who told me that, they are now full preterists as a result of my debates with Dr. Brown. Let me encourage you, go to YouTube, look up Dr. Michael Brown debates Don K. Preston. I think you'll see why these people are now full preterists. Now, when the writer says they were receiving the goal of their faith and that the Old Testament prophets searched diligently, what did they try to know? What is it they were wanting to know about the faith which Peter was preaching, which the diaspora was then, first century, entering into. What was it those Old Testament prophets wanted to know? Point number one, searching what or what manner of time the Spirit of Christ who was in them did testify or was indicating when he testified beforehand the sufferings of Christ and the glories that would follow. The Old Testament prophets desired to know two things. Now, admittedly, the New King James is not the clearest translation that you can find on this verse. The Greek is quite clear. New American Standard, New English Translation, many other translations render this a little more succinctly, a little more clearly. The Old Testament prophets inquired to know the manner and the time of the things which they did speak. Now, wait a minute. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, pardon me, if the Bible says what it means and means what it says, if there's no ambiguity, if everything is clear, clear as it can be, then why is it that the Old Testament prophets search so diligently to know the manner of the fulfillment of their own prophecies? I mean, after all, if they spoke of restoration of the land, if they spoke of the restoration and glorification of the literal physical city of Jerusalem, the literal physical temple, I mean, if those things were to be taken at face value, why did they have to search so diligently to know the manner of the fulfillment? Well, it's because they did not understand the manner of fulfillment. But Peter, to reiterate, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 6, you therefore as living stones are being built up a spiritual house to offer up spiritual sacrifices, a spiritual priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices. You see, the Old Testament prophets did not understand that spiritual nature. Now, should they have understood better? I am convinced they should have. Why? You remember when Jesus had been crucified, been raised from the dead. A couple of his disciples were walking on the road to Emmaus, and they were talking about the things that had just transpired over the last several days. And Jesus said, what are these things that you're speaking of? And they're going, are you a stranger in these parts? You do not know what has taken place? How that this Jesus of Nazareth, we thought it was he that was going to redeem Israel. And besides that, it's the third day that since these things took place. And Jesus said, oh, you foolish guys, slow to understand what the scriptures say. Now, what's Jesus saying? Jesus had just explained to them about his death, burial, and resurrection. They didn't get it. And he chided them for being slow to understand the scriptures. And twice in Luke chapter 24, it tells us Jesus opened their eyes to understand the scriptures. So, did the Old Testament contain the truth about the spiritual nature of things? Well, Jesus said it did. Paul, in speaking about the calling of the Gentiles, the establishment of the church, the preaching the mystery of God, he said that he preached it out of the Old Testament prophets. Well, as I pointed out last week, if Paul said the calling of the Gentiles, the mystery of God, that he preached, and that he preached was from the Old Testament prophets, if the Old Testament prophets didn't preach about the conversion of the Gentiles and the mystery of God and the establishment of the church, how could Paul preach those things from the Old Testament prophets? This is critical. Okay. So Peter said the Old Testament prophets searched diligently to understand the manner of the fulfillment of the things they did testify. Now, look, we could spend a couple of programs on this, illustrating for you from the Tanakh, that is, from the Old Testament, passage after passage after passage that pointed to a radical change in the temple, in the cultus, under the Messianic New Covenant. I have said many, many times in different venues as I have preached that for the astute reader of the Old Testament, there are all sorts of hints and clues and overt statements, really, that under the Messianic reign of Jesus, the Messiah, under that new covenant, things were going to be radically different. Let me share just a couple of examples, okay? Because this is wonderful. In Isaiah chapter 60, which is without any doubt a messianic prophecy. How do I know that? Well, I know that because John in the book of Revelation chapter 20, 15 and following, 21, John quotes directly from Isaiah chapter 60 in its prediction of the coming redeemed Jerusalem and worship in the temple. Now, okay, nothing radical about that. Oh, but wait. In Isaiah chapter 60, starting with about verse 9, it lists several different countries, not of Israel. Okay? It lists the inhabitants of regions not of Israel. Well, here's what's so radical. It says those individuals who were not Levites, they would come, they would ascend the altar of the Lord. Now remember, these are not Levites, okay? But they would ascend the altar of the Lord and offer acceptable sacrifices to Yahweh on the altar. Whoa, time out. Who are the only people authorized to offer sacrifices unto Yahweh at the temple of the Lord? Levites, who are ceremonially pure, who are genealogically confirmed. If you're not a Levite, you better not try to offer sacrifice in the temple at Jerusalem. You better not even try to get to the offer of burnt sacrifice. You will be killed. But Isaiah 60, 9 and following, is talking about people who are not Levites, coming from non-Israelite places, bringing their sacrifices, ascending the altar, that's the burnt offering, altar, and offering sacrifices acceptable to the Lord. Folks, again, this is radical. How could that take place? How could anybody, not of the Levitical tribes, Aaronic tribe, ascend the altar and offer acceptable sacrifices unless and until a 100% radically different kind of, of temple was established, a radically different kind of altar, a radically different kind of priesthood was established. Well, you see, Isaiah chapter 66, 19 and following tells us that after the day of the Lord would take some of the survivors of the day of the Lord and make them to be priests, make them to be Levites. Well, look, if you're not of the Levitical bloodline, nobody can make you to be a Levite, genealogically, genetically. No, what God was saying is he was going to take of Gentiles and create a brand new priesthood. Do you see how radical this is? And then, another real quick example before I move on. Malachi chapter 1, 11 and 12. This was written in a context in which the citizens of Jerusalem and Judea were offering perverted, sick, lame, halt, mutilated sacrifices. And they were offering them to the priest to be offered as sacrifices unto Yahweh. And the Lord had 7 debates with Israel in the book of Malachi, accosting them for their sins. He even challenged them regarding their sacrifices. He said, okay, you don't think your sacrifices are polluted? You think your sacrifices are okay? Go offer them to the governor of the land. See how he reacts. Yeah, they knew. And then the Lord said that the time was coming in which acceptable sacrifices could be offered from the east to the west, anywhere from the rising of the sun to the setting, acceptable sacrifice could be offered. No, wait a minute. One more time. Hang on. Something's wrong here. According to Deuteronomy chapter 12, the only place, God said that when he chose a place, when he put his name at that place, the only place in all of the world for acceptable sacrifice to be offered was in Jerusalem at the temple. Yet now here, Malachi chapter 1, verse 11 and 12, God is saying the time was coming in which it didn't matter. All the way to the east, all the way to the west, wherever you are, acceptable sacrifice can be offered. Now listen, I'm almost out of time for today. So next week, we're going to be talking about how those ancient prophets longed to know the proper time for the coming of the Lord and the coming of salvation. You do not want to miss that. I'll see you then.